Excited to introduce our speaker tonight, Stephanie Ellis. Stephanie has been working in the field of avian conservation, wildlife rehabilitation, and environmental advocacy for nearly 2 decades. She has a wonderful history with SFBBO. She was our outreach specialist and communications director and served as our interim executive director in 2015. She is now back in Massachusetts, where she's originally from, and she is the executive director of Wildcare, a wildlife rehabilitation center, and she'll be sharing a lot of their work with us. So Stephanie, welcome back. It's a pleasure to see you, and thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here. I am going to share my screen. I'm super excited. I see a lot of familiar names. I have a lot of information in this presentation. I got so excited, I got a little bit carried away. I will talk fast, but basically I want to talk to you about the work that I do here on Cape Cod, some of the common species that we see or groups of animals and why. And then also I'll talk a little bit about why I believe wildlife matters and why wildlife rehab matters. And I have some fun animal tales along the way that I'm excited to share with you. So first, Wildcare's mission. We are a 501c3, a nonprofit organization, and we are dedicated to treating sick, injured, and orphaned wildlife for release back into the wild. And so we do rehabilitation and we provide veterinary care and get these animals back out where they belong. This is an immature northern gannet, my most favorite bird on the planet. And this is an immature common eider, my most favorite duck on the planet. A little bit about our programs. We treat over 1,800 animals per year, and I have a staff of 9. And you can imagine a staff of 9, treating 1,800 animals, we couldn't do it just ourselves. So we are incredibly dependent on our volunteers. We have a baby bird and wildlife nursery program, a critical care program in which we provide veterinary care, education and outreach, and volunteer and internship opportunities. And these are 2 eastern gray squirrels. They're eating cornmeals, and most of the animals at Wildcare eat better than most people do. Something that we offer at Wildcare that I think is very, very important is that we run a wildlife emergency helpline. And this helpline operates 365 days per year, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., where people can call us if they find wildlife in distress or if they have a human-wildlife conflict. I always tell people we provide live counseling for your animal-related issues, not for your issues. Then last year we took in over 11,000 phone calls, which to me, that number alone tells me the importance of our work. This is a red-throated loon who was rehabilitated by us and released. I tried to include species in this presentation that most of you don't see commonly in California. I thought that would be of interest to most people. So this is our facility. It's an antique 19th century farmhouse, and we've converted almost every square inch of this property to animal care. It suits our needs, except we're sort of bursting at the seams. We have an expansion project underway so we can accommodate more animals. And I hope that many of you have been to Cape Cod and have been able to visit this beautiful place that I call home. This is where we are located. So Wildcare is here. We're actually in the town of Eastham, just across the Orleans border. But the importance of this map is to show you that Cape Cod, it is an island. It's an island, it's separated by a man-made canal. And we are basically 30 miles out to sea and surrounded by water. And so you can imagine this means that we see aquatic birds throughout the year, all times of year. It's a really incredible place to live. I'm surrounded by water and I live on a sandbar basically. And so I'll talk about some of those species that we see. So a very important structure for us that we have at our facility is this large elliptically shaped Raptor Aviary. And the reason this aviary is so exciting is, first of all, it's the largest of its kind in Massachusetts. So we actually meet the minimum housing requirements to house bald eagles. That's about the biggest bird we'd ever have in there, other than a mute swan, which would be the biggest, heaviest bird we would ever have in there. But it's also a special structure because inside are three inner chambers and then an outer chamber, which forms a continuous loop. And that's important because when you want to condition birds, it's more true to life to have them fly in circles like a treadmill, continuous flight, rather than being placed in a room where they fly back and forth. And that works too. Just it's really ideal and lucky for us to have this, this Raptor treadmill, if I may. This is a red-tailed hawk in our outer chamber getting flight exercise. And this is just what our property looks like in the winter and in the summer. And I love to show this because you can see that that aviary I just showed you is actually bigger than our main facility. So these animals that are housed in there are very, very fortunate. Another critically important part of what we do is we have state-of-the-art seabird therapy pools. And I'm going to talk about these in depth later and talk about some of the species who go through these pools. But these are important because we see hundreds of aquatic birds, and not only do they need to be conditioned for release back into the wild, but they need to be waterproof. These are two common eider hens. I'll actually talk about their story a little later on. So what animals do we treat at Wildcare and why? Why do we get them? So three major categories. We see orphaned, injured, and diseased animals. And at Wildcare, we treat any species of wild bird, wild reptile, amphibian, and small mammals. And so this is a herring gull here on the left. This is a great horned owl. This bird was treated for rodenticide poisoning and he recovered. And this is a brown pelican. And for those of you who know Massachusetts, you're probably saying, what the heck is a pelican doing? That's very far north of their range, their typical range. And what happened was this bird was blown in with Hurricane Sandy. I think that was 2012. Several birds were blown off course and we ended up receiving 2 brown pelicans. And so at that time, we didn't have the pools to rehab the pelicans. So what we did was the one surviving bird, we started the rehab process and then shipped the bird to Florida, where it went to a pelican sanctuary to continue rehab. Now we are ready. We have the pools and we're ready to go. I'm like, just like, bring on the pelicans. We haven't had a pelican since. So the species that we do not see at our facility are the large mammals, or also what we refer to as the rabies vector species. And that's simply because our facility limitations were too small to accommodate these animals. And so this is a coyote pup. And we are very fortunate on Cape Cod to have another wildlife hospital about 40 minutes away. And so when we receive these large mammals, we refer them to the other wildlife hospital, which is nearby. And we all work closely together. It's a really wonderful collaboration. Also, on Cape Cod, you know, we have animals land, air, and sea year round. So we do actually have sea turtles. Most people don't know this. You think of our waters as the cold North Atlantic, and you would be correct. But we do have sea turtles that are traveling. They're basically traveling north to feed. And when they're traveling back south during their migration, if they don't leave before our water temperatures drop below 50, they become cold stunned. And you saw that Cape Cod looks like this. It looks like an arm. These turtles become cold stunned and end up in the bay, and they can't get out. So there's a major effort to rescue cold stunned sea turtles in the fall and early winter. We also have an extremely healthy population of gray seals around Cape Cod. You probably see us in the news because our seal population is so healthy that we also have a very healthy population of great white sharks. I love where I live, just animals everywhere. We in fact cannot rehab all wildlife in Massachusetts. As licensed wildlife rehabilitators, we actually cannot rehabilitate deer, moose, bears, or rattlesnakes. And I'm pretty excited about that because I'm not sure that I would want to rehabilitate rattlesnakes. We don't have rattlesnakes on Cape Cod, but we do have 2 species in Massachusetts. I just wanted to share this because every state is different in terms of their regulations of what you can and cannot rehab. And the deer that we have here on Cape Cod are white-tailed deer. No bears on Cape Cod and no moose. And just to let you know, the different types of, the number of animals that we see in a year. Last year we received 1,810 animals representing 152 different species. And I love to share that because, I think about my staff, they have to have the knowledge of how to care for 152 different species. And we don't always have that knowledge. So then you have to have the knowledge of who to go to, to get information about caring for all these species. I feel really proud of what we do. We see a lot of migratory birds, and we also saw in 2019 2 monarch butterflies, and we did our first successful monarch butterfly wing transplant. So very cool. Okay, so now let's talk about, I'm going to talk about some groups of animals that we commonly see and why we see them. And at the very end of this presentation, I'm going to talk about how you can reduce your impacts on wildlife and how we can all coexist. So we do see several different species of raptors on Cape Cod. Largely, we see red-tailed hawks, eastern screech owls, great horned owls. Now we have 3 different morphs of screech owls here in Massachusetts. There's a brown morph, a gray morph, and a red morph. And of course, I had to put the red morph photo in here because I think they're just exquisite. And this bird matches my sweater, I just realized. That was not intentional. So in 2020, we received 41 raptors. Most of the raptors we receive are suffering from rodenticide poisoning, which is, I'm referring to anticoagulant mouse and rat poison, which we will talk about later. Also hit by car injuries. Some are shot illegally. Some are entangled, great horned owls entangled in soccer nets and silt netting on the side of the road. Starvation and lead poisoning, sadly. Lead poisoning primarily in bald eagles in the winter because they've shifted from feeding on fish to feeding on carcasses when water's frozen over and they can't feed on fish. I threw in the snowy owl here because snowy owls for us, they're incredibly eruptive. And so we don't always see large numbers of them on Cape Cod in the winter. Some years we have huge numbers of them on Cape Cod, and it's all dependent on food sources in the Arctic and also young birds having to disperse and find their own territories and food sources. But this particular snowy owl, sadly, was suffering from rodenticide poisoning. So I like to use this example because this is sort of a top tier predator who's dear to our heart, and unfortunately, is not free from human impact. And here's a couple of stories. So something that happened for us last year that was incredibly exciting was that bald eagles actually nested on Cape Cod. It was the first recorded nest in 115 years. And so bald eagles are making a comeback on the Cape. As you all, I'm sure, know, their populations were decimated nearly across their range due to DDT pesticides. When DDT was outlawed and with captive breeding programs, this species started to rebound. And so in 2019, we received 2 young bald eagles from 2 separate locations. One was from a town called Truro, very small bird. Both of these birds had hatched that year, 2019. This other eagle was found in a town called Harwich, and not exhibiting normal eagle behavior. This bird was sitting on beach chairs and basically chewing on people's beach towels. And so we knew something was very wrong, and we went out and rescued this bird. We had these birds within days apart from each other, and were able to rehab them together, which I think benefited them tremendously. And both these birds were basically inexperienced young birds, inexperienced hunters. They were starving to death. They had anemia, and one of them had detectable levels of lead in its system, detectable but not treatable. We rehabbed these birds. We worked with the state. They were banded. That's a big bird. That's a big wing. And we absolutely loved them. We made headlines. You know, our aviary, it held up to its name. So fortunate to have that large aviary. You can see the bling on this bird. The orange is Massachusetts ban. And I have to say, for one of my staff who's 5 feet tall, having these birds fly around in the aviary over your head is somewhat daunting. And we're going to talk about eagles a little bit more in the end, at the end of the presentation. So orphaned mammals, let's switch to mammals for a minute. As I mentioned, the largest mammal we can accommodate is the Virginia opossum. We see lots of squirrels, white-footed mice, eastern cottontails. This is a squirrel who was shaken by a dog and had a fractured humerus. This squirrel was eventually released. But the main reason that we receive baby mammals especially is due to human impact. Cat and dog interactions, people cutting down trees during the summer months and displacing animals, landscaping, prematurely separated from their mother because their mother's been killed, and habitat loss. Last year, we received 127 eastern gray squirrels, and 2 species that you do not have in California is, that I can recall, is we have a red squirrel, and we also have southern flying squirrels. So these are, they're not true flyers. They have a patagium, a big wing flap, which they use to glide from tree to tree. Beautiful creatures, nocturnal, hence those big, gorgeous eyeballs. And a lot of these animals that come in, again, are orphaned. And squirrels are a lot of work. They require a lot of work. They require hand feeding by my staff. When they're very young, they have to go home with my staff and be fed round the clock. And so they can be with us for 10 to 12 weeks or more. The good news is squirrels are very resilient. And so we're often able to pull a lot of these orphans or adults through. We also receive lots of orphaned mice. And some of you may say, what the heck, why do you rehab mice? Which we're going to get into in a moment. But this is a white-footed mouse. This is one of our native mice. And I actually specialize in the care of white-footed mice for all of the Cape Cod. So those 121 mice, almost all of those animals came to me eventually for hand feeding and then eventually release. Yes, people do bring us mice. It's incredible. Most of the mice are, you know, someone may have moved a box from one place to the next and then found mouse pups in it, or they're using their grill for the first time in the season and there's a mouse nest. Fortunately, with our phone helpline, we do a lot of mitigation and prevention, and mouse moms are the best. They will usually take their babies back with a little bit of encouragement. And if you discourage them from nesting in that location, like your grill or your car, there's so much more to say. I could do a whole presentation on how to encourage and discourage animals. but we don't have enough time, unfortunately. Eastern Cottontails, this is the largest number of a mammal that we receive. The mammal we receive the most of in a year is Eastern Cottontails. They are actually not a native rabbit, and we'll talk about that later, but they're a beloved rabbit. You know, they're not invasive, they're a beautiful creature, and they're an important part of the ecology here. The number one reason that we receive rabbits is usually cat or dog interaction, and then landscapers. And so we do a lot of prevention over the phone. People find baby rabbits and think they're orphaned, and we try to determine if they truly are. And if they are not, we encourage people to leave them there. Another orphan we receive quite a few of is Virginia opossums. And I love opossums. You know, people call them like street rats, and they're not even a rat. They're not a rodent. They are North America's only marsupial. And I'm sure you've heard a lot about them in the news in the past few years because these guys eat tons of ticks. It's thought that they eat thousands of ticks during a season, and they are significantly reducing the tick population that could potentially carry tick-borne diseases to humans. So these are good guys. We want them in our backyards. Most of the opossums we receive are either adults hit by a car or babies found in the pouch of adults who have been hit by a car. So that's how we get most of our orphans, is that people see a dead opossum, they check the pouch, and they find these young joeys in the pouch. We also see, unfortunately, a lot of dog and predator interactions with adult opossums. As you know, they do play opossum. It's a natural response for them, but unfortunately it doesn't fare them well if they do that in the middle of the road, you know, or while an animal is attacking them. So reptiles. Oh my goodness, Cape Cod is like a reptile haven. We have 10 species of turtles alone in Massachusetts, and many of those turtles are located on Cape Cod. And the reason turtles love Cape Cod is because, remember how I told you we are out here, we're 30 miles out to sea. Our climate is generally much milder than the mainland. We're also covered in sand. So that is perfect habitat for turtles that are laying eggs or brumating, which is the reptilian form of hibernation. Also, this mild climate allows them to be out and about for a longer season of the year. This is a beautiful eastern box turtle. It's a species of special concern in Massachusetts. You can see it was chewed here by a dog. And so that turtle came into care with us and was eventually released. I have a few photos of a few of the other species that we see. But the number one reason we receive turtles is in the summer months, they're getting hit by cars. The females are crossing the roads looking for a place to lay their eggs. The males are crossing the road looking for females. And on Cape Cod in the summer, we have millions of people here. So the increased traffic definitely does not do them well. I had to show this because this little beauty right here it's called a Diamondback Terrapin. And they are the only true salt marsh turtle of the Northeast. And the town of Wellfleet on Cape Cod, which is right about here, that is their northernmost breeding range. So we have a whole lot of terrapins on Cape Cod. It's amazing to see a turtle in a marsh, you know, a saltwater turtle. That is not a sea turtle. And they're very beautiful. Unfortunately, they are also susceptible to car strikes. Oops. This is a painted turtle who had a fishing hook lodged into its mouth. It was surgically removed and this turtle was released. This turtle was hit by a car and had a fractured shell. We repaired it. You can see here, and that turtle was released. So another big part of what we do is despite the phone line and all the prevention and education we try to do, we still have people cutting down trees in the summer and displacing babies. And people who allow their cats to free roam, and they're getting into bird nests. So despite all our education, last year we still received 385 baby birds. Most of those were songbirds. Some of them were, ducklings, goslings, turkey poults. So 385 orphans representing 49 different species. And that is a lot of mouths to feed. And they need to eat. We basically feed our baby birds from 6 a.m. To 7 p.m. And so we have a team of over 40 volunteers who basically do baby bird shifts, where they come for a shift once a week for 3 hours, and that's all they do is feed baby birds, because we need to get them fed and clean. All they do is eat and poop and grow. So we need the volunteers to help us with that. We also, something that I specialize in for the state of Massachusetts is the care of orphaned ruby-throated hummingbirds. That's our only breeding hummingbird on Cape Cod and Massachusetts, and I specialize in their care. Thank goodness I don't get many of them. Last year I rehabbed and released 4, because they are also a tremendous amount of work, and they're with me for many weeks. So the reasons that we get songbirds, number 1 is cat interaction, dog interaction, landscaping, tree felling, window strikes. We encourage people, please do your tree felling and your pruning in the late fall or winter months and avoid displacing babies. And here's just an example. Here's my hummingbird aviary at my home. You can see it's filled with flowers. I do what's called a soft release at my home. And these are just a few of our other songbird aviaries on our property. And I wish I had more time, because all of this is, you have to meet the specific needs of so many different species. It's not like you throw them all into an aviary and, they would all get along and they all eat the same food. Everything is very, very different depending on the species. It's a lot of work and a lot of knowledge. Okay, so now let's shift gear to my most favorite birds on the planet. Well, this bird right here. This is an immature northern gannet, and they are a bird of the North Atlantic, and they winter here in large numbers off our shores. They're a pelagic seabird, and I call them the North Atlantic booby, because they basically are a booby. They're part of that family. This is an immature common eider, a male. They also winter here in huge numbers, and we do have some breeding common eider around the Boston Harbor Islands, but the majority of the population we see is in the winter, and they're breeding in the Arctic. This is a young herring gull. What a beauty. And this bird, who looks like a football or a meatloaf, is a surf scoter. And we had to pluck all of his major flight feathers, and that's why he looks so odd. We see surf scoters in the winter, along with 2 other species of scoter. We get white-winged scoter and also black scoter. So why do we get all these aquatic birds? Well, we live on a sandbar surrounded by water, and in the summer, we have all these breeding seabirds, and then they, many of them migrate. And then in the winter, we have an influx of birds coming from the north to winter with us. We see a lot of fishing debris, entanglements and ingestion of lead pellets, sinkers. We see oiled seabirds, storms. The biggest reason that we get birds like alcids, like our puffins, our murres, our dovekies, is prolonged northeast storms that blow the birds in. We do get hit by a car, animal attacks, and habitat and nest disturbance. This was a great blackback gull who had swallowed a hook, and we were able to surgically remove that, and the bird was ultimately released. I love these birds so much. I love the alcids. So this is a common murre, and you also have them. You have your Pacific common murres. This is an Atlantic puffin in a winter plumage, that's sooty but still beautiful face. And you can see that this bird is on a net, And the reason for that is this is a pelagic species. They spend their life at sea. They only go to land to breed, land being rocky cliffs and colonies in Maine and further north. And so we can't keep them on a hard surface when they're not in the pools because it would cause pressure sores and other problems. So this net allows, it alleviates pressure sores, and it also allows for poop to fall through so that waterproofing does not get soiled. And this is really important because most people don't realize that birds are not magically waterproof. They do not magically waterproof themselves. It's something they have to work on. And so birds have a preening gland on their rump. It secretes fatty acids and lipids. They squeeze it with their beak and then they wipe it onto all their feathers. This waterproofs the feathers and also, keeps the integrity of the feathers. And so if birds are not feeling well or they're injured, it's like us, if we have the flu, we might not comb our hair for several days. And so these birds are the same, they don't preen. So when you put them in the pool, the first thing they do is they start to sink. They also start to get cold because those feathers, which are their most effective insulators, are not effective because they're not waterproof. So all of our seabirds, they go through these seabird therapy pools. It's very, very important. These are our pools, and we have the ability to run them warm or cold. The warm is for birds that are just starting to get put out onto the pools. In this way, we know their waterproofing is compromised, but their body temperature won't drop as quickly because they're in warm water. What happens is when you put a bird in a pool and they're not waterproof, the first thing they start doing is they want to jump out of the water and start preening. And that's exactly what we want them to do. We want them to start that preening process. We won't go through all of this, but just so you know, this system is, it's fully recycled water. We have biological filter and UV filter. And this is water that's being recirculated that is clean and will not contaminate the bird's feathers. This is an overflow slot because when you think about the birds we're putting in these pools, a lot of them are fish eaters or they're eating mollusks, and we do not want the slippery, oily, the fish oils from their poop to soil their feathers. And so we have this overflow slot, which basically it runs and the water continuously takes that oil off of the top so that it doesn't soil feathers. So all of this whole system is very intentional and it works. Except sometimes in the winter, we've got so many birds going through there. And if they're going through a molt, the system gets clogged. And yes, we have system disasters where we have to clean everything out and unclog. So this is a common eider hen on the seabird net. Ideally, birds will be able to be on the pool all day and be completely waterproof, no compromised feathers, and that tells us that they are ready for release. Well, along with several other factors that we won't get into, but obviously behavior needs to be appropriate. They need to be a good body weight, no further ailments, etc., etc. When they come out of the pools, we often can blow dry them with this hot air dryer, and they absolutely love it. It is a day spa. Day spa for ducks. Day spa for water birds. So these two eider hens, they were rehabilitated together and they were released. And I'm just going to check. Okay. Checking my time. So back to the deep sea birds. It's so interesting because some winters we see a lot of alcids, and the alcids again are your dovekies, your puffins, your murres, your razorbills. And I call 2017 the year of the alcid because we got 37 dovekies, 34 in 1 week. And it might not seem like anything, except these birds, they are very, very difficult to care for in rehab. They have an extremely high metabolism. And we need to constantly pump nutrition into them. They need to be on the pools, in the water. It's the most natural environment we can provide them. And so we try to do a really quick turnaround and get them back out the door within 24 hours. So I feel good about, of this set of dovekies, we were able to release 16. And that was really quite good. And to release them, we either release them at night or we release them by boat. And the reason for that is, you know, these guys are called sea robins. They're very, very small. And when we release them by day, our big black-backed gulls will swallow them whole. And so our job is to, you know, first do no harm. Let's give these guys the best fighting chance possible. So at night, when the gulls are in bed, we can release these dovekies, or we have boats take them offshore. So imagine a tiny little creature like this is so much work. It's very, very challenging to rehabilitate dovekies. 2020 was also, I would say, a year of the Alcid, where we received 20 dovekies in over 2 days. And these birds are primarily being blown in when we have these sustained northeast storms, northeast winds and high seas. These birds are getting blown around for 48 to 72 hours. Anyone with an underlying condition or weakened becomes weakened and washes up. And we always know when we start getting the calls that, you know, there's a bird that looks like a penguin and it's in the parking lot. It's at the dollar store and in the parking lot and it looks like a Nerf football. We always know it's like, get the bathtubs ready because the dovekies are coming in. They're amazing creatures. So that is, I hope that was interesting to all of you. That was just to show a representation of some of the different types of animals that we see in our care. And now I want to shift gears and talk about why these animals are important and why I think wildlife rehab is important. So I've already expressed that I personally feel so grateful to live in a place that is so rich in biodiversity, air, land, and sea. Everywhere you look, we have wildlife here, and people flock here because of nature. This is a coyote. These are the classic American robin eggs. And so an important thing to point out is, as much as we look to animals, you know, we look to wildlife as a respite from our busy lives, and they add intrinsic value. But we often forget how much animals actually need us to maintain a balance. And so I'd like to remind people that the majority of the animals, almost half, that we receive at Wildcare have some type of human impact, and that's why they were brought to us. So in 2018, of 1,857 animals, 43% were known to be impacted negatively by people. And that's pretty significant. And then the three top reasons why we receive animals is due to cat or dog interaction, hit by vehicle or equipment, or nest and habitat disturbance. And I sometimes hear people say, you know, oh, I saw a duck or I saw a gull on the beach and I decided to just leave it there because I wanted to let nature take its course. Well, to me, in this day and age, given all the information that I just gave you with human impact, to me, there's really no such thing as nature taking its course. Nature's trying to take its course, but we're getting in the way. And this razorbill here is a perfect example. You know, you might see this bird on the shore. To an untrained eye, you might think the bird is just resting. And what I can see is that this bird is actually oiled on the back. Never mind the fact that a razorbill, which is a truly pelagic species, should never set foot on our shores ever. We only see them in the winter and they're not breeding. They're just there feeding offshore. So, you know, I would say, how is oil a part of nature? It's not. And so we often get in the way of animals Here's a squirrel who was shot. Here's a gull who swallowed a hook. And this leads me to another question that I'm sometimes asked. So this is a white-footed mouse pup who weighs 2.34 grams and is the size of a small paperclip. Why the heck do you save squirrels and mice? Like, who cares? They're vermin and they're everywhere. And I remind people that every animal matters. They all have an important story to tell, but also they play important ecological roles. Eastern gray squirrels, I know you also have them on the West Coast, non-native species. For us, they're extremely important forest regenerators. Those thousands of acorns that they hide every summer and fall, they cannot remember where they've cached them all. And so then you have the next crop of your oak trees. Mice are very important for aeration of soil, for seed dispersal, and they're also an incredibly important prey item for so many mammals and birds. So these animals are all very important in the environment. I also like to remind people, you know, okay, so squirrels and mice are so abundant, who cares? Well, that's what we thought about the passenger pigeon as well. This species, which is now extinct, in the early 1800s, they were known to literally blacken the sky when they passed over. There were billions of passenger pigeons, and it was believed that there were so many that no level of exploitation could ever hinder their population levels. Well, here we are, you know, in 2020, and these birds have been extinct since, I believe it's 1914. And what happened was they didn't have the conservation efforts back then or the tools that we have. They didn't have mapping and banding and cameras and transmitters. And also, they didn't have the knowledge to understand that this species could be perhaps extinct. So these birds were decimated for food, for fun, for fashion. And so my point here is the time to protect a species is while it is still common. And this brings me to why wildlife rehab is important. Before I talk about that, I just want to talk about the One Health paradigm because it's critically important to the work that I do. And I have a definition here that I'm just going to read from. But the One Health approach, this was developed by CDC. The One Health approach states that the health of people is closely connected to the health of animals in our shared environment. Basically, it's the canary in the coal mine type of scenario where what is impacting animals in their environment is surely impacting us. And so I see this firsthand. As rehabbers, we are the eyes and ears on the ground for understanding what these animals are facing in the wild. We are eyes and ears on the ground for understanding emerging diseases with the wildlife, environmental impacts, ecological disasters, and we share that information willingly because it can help with the conservation of a species. This photo is from in 2017. We were starting to see a lot of gannets coming in and they all had neurological symptoms. And we work closely with Massachusetts Fish and Wildlife, US Fish and Wildlife, USGS. When we start to see trends, we start to report them because we know something's wrong. And so what happened was we received all these gannets. Sadly, I want to say that only maybe 8 of these birds survived. But after looking at the necropsies and testing, these birds had cyanobacteria. And so we learned, you know, cyanobacteria, we're seeing that increasingly on Cape Cod because of climate change, you know, global warming, warming waters, and increased people. And so this is becoming a problem on Cape Cod. And so here's an example where, you know, that information is very valuable, especially to authorities, so they can make decisions that can help to aid a species. Another example was 2018. Massachusetts saw its first outbreak of Newcastle's disease. It's a virulent disease that is related to the paramyxoviruses, so mumps, measles, and other respiratory diseases. We ended up becoming the epicenter for understanding this virus, the distribution, where it may have started from, and we worked with local authorities to ship carcasses for testing. It's so important. And my point of showing you these is that we really are on the forefront of understanding what these birds, what's happening to these animals in the wild. Here's an example in 2019, a king eider. It was found deceased. And it was found in Alaska near the Pribilof Islands. And this bird was banded, and from that band they knew that this bird had actually been a victim of an oil spill in 1996. It survived rehabilitation. So it was oiled, and then it was cleaned and rehabbed, released, and it survived for 23 years until it was found deceased on the shores, not far from where it was originally oiled. And so this was just incredible to know, that rehab animals can survive rehabilitation. Of course, we don't always know. I wish the animals could come back to us and tell us how they're doing, come back and visit. But this was just an extraordinary example of, that did make a difference for that one bird. Okay, I had to put this example in here because even the deceased have value to us. Of course, we want to save all of our patients, but the reality is, if you can pick up a sick or injured animal, and put it under your arm and put it in your car, something's very wrong. So a lot of what we see is end-stage disease, injuries. That said, there is a lot of survival as well. Otherwise, we wouldn't do this work. But there is even value in the deceased. And here is, I think, an extraordinary example of that. We had received this beautiful female long-tailed duck, a species that winters here in huge numbers. And I think 75% of their Atlantic winter population is actually here in the winter off Cape Cod. So we received this bird, and the bird was in terrible shape. It died within just a few hours of arrival. But I had noticed that it had a telemetry device which had been implanted into its abdomen. I knew this information was valuable. The bird was also banded. So I reported the bird, and the researcher responded. I did a necropsy on this bird, and I removed the telemetry device. What was incredible was, even though the researcher was also sad that the bird was dead, she provided us with so much information. What we learned was, a year prior to this bird being rescued and brought to us, that bird was banded and had the telemetry implant. And then the bird took off, and it traveled 1,900 miles from Cape Cod to Nunavut, which is Canadian Arctic territory. And we know from the telemetry signals that she departed Cape Cod on April 26th, arrived in her breeding grounds in Nunavut in June, and she had stopped at the Bay of Fundy, Gulf of St. Lawrence, Hudson Bay. Then what happened was she gave out the signal. Basically, there was no further signal, and the researcher wasn't certain why. And because we ended up getting her, we then knew that she returned to the Cape that following winter. And fascinatingly, where she was rescued was almost the exact location where she had been banded. So it shows winter site fidelity. It also showed it was not known that they went further than Hudson Bay, further north, to breed. So there's just all this information from this one individual animal. And again, I wish that she was alive, but it also reminds me, if someone walked by that duck and said, let's let nature take its course, we wouldn't have this valuable information about this species. So here is where she went, all from little Cape Cod all the way up to Nunavut, which I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that correctly, and so I will just apologize. I'm going to skip through this turn event, but it's just another example of you know, us working with authorities when we see things in the environment that are not quite right, trying to work with authorities to solve problems. We do have, you know, we have a database of information that can be used to help a species. We're also working with Mass Wildlife because we have 2 species of cottontails in New England, in Massachusetts, and on Cape Cod. Our eastern cottontail is widely abundant and is not a native species. They're not invasive, but they were introduced in the early 1900s as a game species. They are pushing out the native species of New England cottontail. You can see them here. And why this is all important is because it's almost impossible to determine which species you are looking at in the fields, even in the hand. You really can only discern the species by looking at tissue genetics or genetic material from feces, or looking at their skulls. So I told you that we took in 375 cottontails. Many of those did survive, but the ones that did not survive were given to Mass Fish and Wildlife so they can do genetic studies. And this is giving them an understanding for where New England cottontails actually are on Cape Cod. That will be important habitat to preserve, since this is a species that had been declining. So we collaborate with many, many different organizations across the country. I felt privileged to speak in St. Louis at a National Wildlife Rehabilitation Conference. I spoke on the rehab of swifts, hummingbirds, and white-footed mice. Okay, so here's my happy stories and how we can all coexist with wildlife. So wildlife rehab also helps, it can aid in critical population species recovery. I often hear people say that rehab doesn't matter because you're only helping individuals, and individuals don't make or break a population unless you're talking about critically low population levels. Well, I disagree for all the reasons that I just mentioned in the past hour. But also, when you think about the bald eagle, it was nearly extirpated throughout its entire range, almost extinct in the United States prior to the banning of DDT. And this is a species that was federally endangered and was state threatened and is now listed as special concern because their populations are increasing. And so I feel really good, you know, to rehab this animal that has come back from the brink of extinction and still needs our help. Also, there are some animals who we are able to place into facilities to become part of a captive breeding program. And I have to say, this doesn't always happen. Most animals we see, if they're not releasable, they have to be humanely euthanized. But we have a few examples of birds that have been placed into breeding programs at various zoos throughout the country. And one of them is Murray, this common murre. Absolutely beautiful. This bird could not be released because of a lack of feathers on one part of his body, which basically rendered him not waterproof enough to be released. And so we had this perfect bird, but with that issue. And if you live in the North Atlantic, you need to be 110% waterproof. So this bird now lives at the Omaha Zoo, where they are really hoping that Murray lays an egg. She's the only wild genes at the zoo in their murre population. And so in the event that this species were in decline, this single bird can perhaps help with species recovery. We also placed a razorbill into the National Aquarium in Baltimore. Again, a situation, we had a perfect bird, but he was blind in one eye. This is our razorbill here named Long John Silversides. He's in Baltimore and he paired with a razorbill named Sandy. And they are truly hoping, again, with his wild genes, that Sandy will lay an egg and again play a role in species recovery. I think this is my last, yes, my last species recovery animal. This is a piping plover. In the state of Massachusetts, piping plovers are a threatened species. They're also federally threatened. They love Cape Cod. They love sandy barrier beaches. And they have been increasing, thank goodness, due to protection efforts in the past couple of years. But this little bird came to us as a plover chick. I had a permanently injured wing and was not releasable. And fortunately, our New England Aquarium in Boston, they were delighted to have this bird on their exhibit. So this is a public exhibit where people can visit and learn about the importance of this species and see Parker the plover up close. So we do a ton of outreach and education, such as this program, really encouraging people to reduce their negative impacts on wildlife and to coexist with wildlife. And so my last slides tonight are how you can coexist with wildlife. And hopefully at the end of this presentation, you will all realize how important you are and what a difference you can make in the lives of the animals in your backyard. This is a Virginia opossum. I'm going to go through most of these bullet points with a few slides. So we highly encourage, if you can keep your dead trees, your snags, your logs, I know they might be unsightly, but if they're not a safety concern, there's probably a million things living in them. And if it's not owls living in them, in salamanders, it could be thousands of bugs that owls and salamanders eat. I always say trees are never really dead. And so I highly encourage you to save your tree felling and your pruning for the winter months if you can. The #1 reason we receive baby owls is because people have felled trees and didn't know that they were nesting in them. Owls are a tough one because here on the East Coast, they are actually the earliest breeding bird that we have. So screech owls are often sitting on eggs as early as March, and great horned owls are often sitting on eggs in February. And they're crazy because it'll be snowing and they'll be sitting on eggs. So, you know, I try to also take your trees down, but make sure everything's down before February. Cats indoors. I'm preaching to the choir here because you're all bird lovers and bird researchers. And so you already know that cats are responsible for the death of over 2.4 billion birds annually in the US. That's according to the American Bird Conservancy. And that does not even take into account bird deaths in the world because of cats, and also beneficial insects, beneficial reptiles, mammals that cats kill. It is simply safer for your cat and safer for the wildlife if your cats are kept indoors. If your cat must be outside, I highly encourage you to build or buy a catio, which is an indoor-outdoor patio for your cat. So your cat feels like it's in the great outdoors, yet it is safely contained and it won't hurt the wildlife. Reduce window strikes. So also according to American Bird Conservancy, over 1 billion birds per year die from window strikes in the United States. We could do a whole program on this and what to do. I always tell people a simple thing you can do is keep your windows dirty and blame it when your friends come over. You can blame it on the birds. I personally love UV decals, taking note of migration and patterns, and keeping lights off during the height of migration as to not disorient birds. There are many, many things we can do. Unfortunately, we don't have time to talk about it. I just want you to know this is a northern parula. They are migratory species here, And I'm happy to tell you that this bird, even though it struck a window, it did recover and it was released. He was one of the lucky ones. Rodenticides, another thing we could talk about all night. Please say no to rodenticides and glue traps. When I say rodenticides, I'm referring to the anticoagulant rat and mouse poisons. These are poisoning our top predators, our raptors, our large mammals, and really they are the most effective rodent control that we could ever have. So the irony there. What happens is when you poison a mouse with an anticoagulant, the debilitated mouse goes outside and now is easy prey for an animal like this red-tailed hawk or this great horned owl, and they now become poisoned. It's referred to as secondary poisoning. There are numerous alternatives to using poison, and I'm happy to report that these two animals did survive. We rehabilitated them and they were released. This screech owl is stuck on a glue plate. I think they're the cruelest things on the planet. They trap the unintended. I also think it's an inhumane death for a rodent. But we frequently get wrens and snakes and even frogs from glue traps who are going after insects that are stuck to the plate. So I say, do not use them. They're terrible, terrible products. Excuse me, please avoid using lead. There are numerous alternatives for fishing. You don't have to use lead. Also numerous non-lead alternatives for hunting. This is a common loon in the Northeast. The #1 killer of our common loons is lead poisoning. We do test for it at Wildcare. We treat for it. Sadly, many of the birds that come in are already, they're suffering other effects related to lead poisoning. And so get the lead out. Go home and clean your tackle boxes out and take everything to the toxic waste portion of your landfill. Help a turtle across the road. If you see a turtle crossing the road, the kindest thing you can do for it is move it to the side in which it was traveling. Do not move it to another location. For us in the state of Massachusetts, it's illegal to do that for most species, but also you wouldn't want to move, say, a terrestrial forest turtle into a pond when it's not an aquatic animal. This is a snapping turtle, by the way. She had a fractured shell here and here, and you can see that she was filled with eggs. We rehabilitated and released her. We also allowed her to deposit her eggs on our property during her rehab. One of the simplest and kindest things that you can do for wildlife is to get a nest box. Build it or buy it and they will come. It's nature's cheapest real estate investment. As you all know, there's a tremendous lack of natural cavities available for birds and for other creatures like squirrels. And that's because of people taking down dead trees, but also there's competition for tree cavities with non-native species. And so if you place a nest box, you might get unexpected visitors, which I always think is fun. And also leave the nest box up year-round because animals might roost in it. And I think this is my last slide on how to help wildlife. So living on the water, being surrounded by water, as I mentioned earlier, we see numerous cases of fishing debris-related injuries and illnesses in wildlife. This was a great blackback gull whose foot was hooked here with a fishing hook. We've seen an increase in cases on Cape Cod in all different species. It's not just birds, it's also turtles. This was a laughing gull who ingested a hook and monofilament. This was the painted turtle with the embedded hook into its jaw. And this is a northern gannet who had a fishing lure embedded into his neck. This was surgically removed. The bird was treated. He was released. surgically removed, treated, released. Sadly, this laughing gull had other grave injuries and had to be humanely euthanized. And by the way, laughing gulls, we have the largest laughing gull breeding population in the North Atlantic. Beautiful, beautiful little birds. They're one of the black-headed gulls. This is a bird going into its winter plumage, and they're absolutely stunning, lovely little birds. So seeing this increase in fishing debris related injuries, we wanted to do something about it. And so what we did was in the town of Chatham, which is very much a recreational fishing town, tourist town, a place where people go also to observe nature, we decided to put up these PVC receptacles, which have signs which basically tell people to trash your tackle here. Don't leave it on the ground where children, pets, and wildlife can get entangled in it. Trash it here. And every 2 weeks, we basically collect that, and then we redistribute it. So it's either trashed appropriately or recycled. Obviously, we use this as a great public outreach opportunity. So we post what we find on social media. And this is a pilot project that's fairly new. So I'm not so sure we're seeing any results yet. But just the fact that, you know, in 1 week, we might have 300 feet of monofilament in one of the receptacles. To me, that's already a success, because that's something that could have been in the water or rolling around on the beaches. And my last part on this is, if you are fishing and you hook a bird, please don't cut the line. Please reel the bird in, throw a towel or a blanket over it, put it in a box, and then cut the line. Birds cannot digest fish hooks, and neither can we. And so when you cut the line, they fly off, you know, it's perforated, probably the esophagus, infection sets in, obstruction, et cetera, et cetera. By the time the bird's debilitated enough to be caught, they usually have numerous issues. Whereas a bird like this herring gull, they caught the bird, they reeled it in, got him in a box, cut the line, brought him to us. Guess what? We surgically removed it. He got a 2-day dose of antibiotics and he was back out the door. And I'm sure he had a lot of good stories to tell all of his fellow herring gulls. So I talked really fast because that was a lot of info, but I hope that this presentation taught you all that every animal does matter, and also we all matter. Each one of us is an ambassador for wildlife and for the environment, and we can all make a positive difference for wildlife with our actions. Something as simple as putting up a nest box in your yard can make a big difference. I also hope that the next time you see that darn squirrel in your backyard who's eating all your bird food, at the bird feeders, I hope that you don't see them as much as a pesky squirrel. Think of them as the furry forest regenerator. They're planting all your trees and distributing all your seeds and feeding all your hawks. They're pretty great. They're important. So Wildcare, we always love your support. Actually, what I would love is if you would go to our Facebook page and follow us, because there we share tidbits of information about coexisting with wildlife, and we share information about our upcoming talks. And with that, I was hoping to end at 9:15 my time, and it's 9:14, so I'm good, Serena. Thank you all so much for attending.
Yes, thank you so much, Stephanie, for sharing such a wonderful presentation. And I think I can say this for everybody. Thank you and Wildcare for, you know, all this important work that you do helping animals and wildlife. I know that's, I mean, clearly there's so much that goes into it to help all these different species. And so it's great that you're there helping them. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, so now we will go into the questions and answers. We do have a few in the chat. So I'm going to go ahead and share our ending slide for our future event. And then I will pull up those questions. So first of all, let me just say, I apologize if I mispronounce your name, but I am going to just try to mention these first names. So our first question is from Michael. So early on in the presentation, you talked about non-migratory birds. So what species do you mean by that?
So the non-migratory birds would be, we have a lot of wild turkey on Cape Cod. We do rehabilitate non-native species. So we do see European starling, house sparrow, mute swan.
Okay, and then Beth said, can someone in New Hampshire, say, call your resource phone line, and if they have a question or an injured animal?
Yes, they absolutely can. We would probably refer them to most fish and wildlife organizations now have a resource page where you can locate a wildlife rehabilitator in your state. But absolutely, you can call us and we'll try to help you find the resources.
Karen asked, are there such things as wildlife corridors for turtles? And do you know if anyone has had any success with things like tunnels under the road or something like that?
You know, I do not know. I feel like I hear a lot in the news about California having wildlife corridors for mountain lions and bobcats, and that they are effective. On the East Coast, I don't hear as much about that. I would love, what we do here is we put a lot of signage up. So if there's a location, for example, where Diamondback Terrapins are known to nest, there are threatened salt marsh turtle. There are signs encouraging people to slow down. This is a heavy turtle area. It doesn't necessarily work. There are efforts to create habitat that is away from the road for those critical species. I would love a turtle bridge. We have so many turtles here. It's amazing.
Laura said, I read that pine siskins are getting salmonella. Have you had siskins come in with that illness, and how do you deal with it?
So it's so interesting. Today was our first day that we received 2 siskins that look like they have salmonella. So as you all know, it's been a big eruptive year for siskins, I think, throughout the country. And so I was consulting with veterinarians, and it looks like there is concern if you use antibiotics, there's a resistance that can develop. But also, even if you use antibiotics to treat the symptoms, they can still shed it into the environment, and it's contagious and zoonotic. You know, salmonella is something we can get. So that's my long way of saying that we're trying to figure out if humane euthanasia is the best option, or if we can safely treat these birds and get them released back out into the wild. I will say this, we do see conjunctivitis, the mycoplasma, in finches, and we do treat it. We have to keep them in isolation, and then we always release back where they were found, because we don't want to introduce it into a new environment. But it definitely poses risks, especially with so many birds coming in and out of our doors. We don't want to transmit it to another one of our patients.
Great, and actually, there was another question that mentioned, so as you mentioned, yes, you do get house finches with conjunctivitis. And so how do you treat it?
So we treat it with, there's an antibiotic it's sold for poultry as a powder, and it's called Tylan. And we basically put it in their water. And the great thing is house finches seem very food driven. So even when their eyes are like completely sealed over, we often can get them to eat and drink. And that's wonderful, because if they drink the medicated water, we treat them for, I think it's a period of 26 days. So it's a long period of time. And initially we put triple antibiotic ointment into their eyes also, and to make them comfortable and to sort of loosen up that crust. And so it's pretty amazing. If they're not already too far gone, we start to see improvement very quickly, if that makes sense. But what happens is a lot of these birds, they come in, and because they've been blind, they're so emaciated and have other issues related to that. So, but we are able to pull quite a few of them through. And then we encourage the finder to, you know, go home and take your feeders down, wash them with bleach solution, et cetera, et cetera.
And Michael asked, why did you pluck that scoter's flight feathers that you showed?
That's such a great question. I love that bird. By the way, we nicknamed him Scooby, like Scooby-Doo. I don't know why, but so that bird washed up on shore and was severely emaciated, anemic, and for some reason, his major flight feathers of his wings and tail were like completely almost stripped. And so we can't, it's not realistic for us to keep a water bird through an entire, until they molt those out. So what we did was under anesthesia, I think it took 2 times under anesthesia, one of our veterinarians plucked those major flight feathers. And then that forces the follicle to start producing those new feathers. And so thank God for him, it was like, we all of a sudden the feathers started to grow in a little bit, and then bam, he went through a full molt. So he went from looking like a football to this beautiful fully feathered scoter. So we sometimes do that if the bird is healthy enough to withstand anesthesia. And then we also do pain management, because, you know, it's like waking up and having had all your hair pulled out. So so we want to keep them comfortable. He did really well. Good, cool bird.
Wow, that's fascinating. Let's see. Our next question is from Linda. Do you have an on-site lab for blood work? And do you have on-site x-ray machines?
Yes, great question. So we do. We have an on-site x-ray machine, which has been a godsend. It takes out a lot of guesswork, of course. We also have a blood lead analyzer, so we can look at the level of lead within an animal's bloodstream. We do have microscopes, so we look at fecal samples, and then we can take basic blood work there, a hematocrit basically, which will tell us the volume of circulating red blood cells. And so we can do basic diagnostic tests that give us a decent idea of how that animal is doing.
Awesome, thank you. And I think that is actually our last question. So if anybody has any last questions, you can go ahead and type those in. But if not, I do want to thank you all for sticking around and for joining us for this great talk. And of course, I want to thank Stephanie for sharing all this fantastic information from how these birds get, and other wildlife get, you know, rehabbed, how you get them healthy again, what happens to them, things we can do to help these animals and prevent us from having such a huge impact on them. So thank you so much. And it's also great to see that these rescued animals can also contribute to science in a lot of ways too. So yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Of course. And Stephanie, is there anything else you want to say to everybody before we log off?
I just want to say thank you everyone for attending.